What if everything you thought you knew about your marriage was a carefully constructed lie? The rain hammered against the chapel windows like accusations I couldn't answer, and I stood there in my black dress watching them lower Daniel into the ground, wondering how my entire world had collapsed in just 72 hours. The cemetery grass squelched beneath my heels as mourners I didn't recognize offered hollow condolences, their expensive perfumes mixing with the smell of wet earth and dying flowers. And I felt like I was drowning in a nightmare I couldn't wake from. Daniel had always told me his family was complicated, that his father was someone we needed to keep at a distance. But standing there watching the casket disappear into that dark hole, I realized I had never truly understood what he meant. Most of the crowd had already scattered to their Mercedes and Teslas, eager to escape the downpour and return to their comfortable lives, leaving me alone with my grief and the suffocating feeling that something about Daniel's accident didn't add up the way the police report claimed. That's when I felt him approach, a presence that changed the temperature around me even before I turned. Victor Carter moved through the rain like it wouldn't dare touch him without permission, his charcoal suit somehow immaculate despite the weather, his steel-gray eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. He was taller than I remembered from the wedding Daniel had tried so hard to keep small and private, his salt and pepper hair slicked back perfectly, his face carved from the same cold marble as the surrounding headstones. Everything about him screamed power and control. From the way he carried himself to the subtle nod he gave the remaining security personnel, who immediately created a perimeter around us. I had only met Victor Carter twice before, brief uncomfortable encounters where he'd looked at me like I was something his son had tracked in on his shoes, an inconvenient mistake that would eventually correct itself. Now he stood before me with something different in his expression, something that made every instinct scream at me to run, even as my legs refused to move. "Naomi, we need to talk about your future," he said, his voice smooth and dangerous like poisoned honey, and I watched his hand gesture toward a black limousine idling near the cemetery gates like a patient predator. I wanted to tell him I had nothing to say to him, that Daniel had spent years building a life separate from the Carter empire for good reasons. But the words stuck in my throat when I saw the folder Margaret Hines was carrying as she emerged from the vehicle. She was Victor's attorney, a woman whose reputation for destroying people in courtrooms was legendary, her severe bun and ice blue eyes behind designer glasses, making her look like a beautiful executioner. The rain drummed against the leather portfolio she held, and I knew with absolute certainty that whatever was inside would change everything. Victor stepped closer, close enough that I could smell his expensive cologne mixing with the scent of rain and freshly turned earth. And when he spoke again, his voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper that somehow felt more threatening than any shout. "Daniel's estate, the house you're living in, your bank accounts, everything you think you own is held in a family trust that I control completely," Victor said, letting each word land like a physical blow, and I felt my knees weaken as Margaret opened the portfolio to reveal page after page of legal documents I couldn't begin to understand. The rain seemed to pound harder, or maybe that was just my heart hammering against my ribs as Victor continued, his steel-gray eyes never leaving my face, watching my reaction like a scientist observing an experiment. He explained that Daniel had never actually owned anything outright, that every asset was technically Carter family property held in trust with provisions that Victor as patriarch could revoke at any time for any reason he deemed appropriate. My modest teacher salary suddenly felt like a lifeline thrown to someone drowning in the Pacific, completely inadequate for maintaining the life Daniel and I had built together. Victor let the silence stretch, let me process the cage I was suddenly trapped in, before delivering the final blow with a smile that never reached his cold eyes. "But it doesn't have to be difficult, Naomi," Victor said, his voice shifting to something almost paternal though his eyes remained predatory, and I watched him exchange a meaningful glance with Margaret that made my stomach turn. He painted a picture of guidance and protection, of bringing me into the family business properly, of public appearances and charity galas and board meetings where I would stand by his side as the grieving widow supported by her devoted father-in-law. The way he described it sounded almost reasonable, almost kind, except for the underlying threat woven through every word like razor wire wrapped in silk. If I refused, if I insisted on maintaining my independence and my distance from the Carter Empire, I would find myself homeless and penniless within 30 days, fighting legal battles I couldn't afford against attorneys who destroyed people for sport. Margaret handed me a pen, platinum and heavy in my rain-slicked fingers, pointing to signature lines on contracts I hadn't had time to read, let alone understand. I looked down at Daniel's fresh grave, at the flowers already being beaten down by the relentless rain, and I felt something crack inside my chest. This was why Daniel had left, why he'd chosen a quiet life teaching literature at a community college instead of taking his place in his father's empire, why he'd always changed the subject when I asked about his family's wealth. He had been protecting me from this, from Victor, from a world where people were chess pieces and love was just another asset to be acquired and controlled. But Daniel was gone now, taken from me in a car accident the police said was caused by brake failure, though my husband had just had the car serviced 2 weeks earlier. I thought about my small apartment before Daniel, about the students who needed me at Roosevelt High School, about the life I could theoretically rebuild from nothing if I just walked away right now. Then I thought about the home Daniel and I had made together, about sleeping in our bed and cooking in our kitchen, and keeping the pieces of him alive in the space we'd shared. And I realized Victor knew exactly which pressure points to press. "I need time to think," I heard myself say, my voice barely audible over the rain, but Victor's hand closed around my wrist with surprising strength. Not painful but absolutely firm, leaving no doubt about who held the power here. He told me I had until tomorrow evening, that Margaret would be at my house at 6 o'clock sharp with the paperwork, and that he expected me to make the intelligent choice. His fingers released me slowly, deliberately, and I rubbed the spot where he'd held me, feeling like I'd been branded somehow. As Victor walked away toward his limousine, Margaret lingering just long enough to hand me a business card with her personal cell number, I stood there in the rain wondering what the hell I was supposed to do. The cemetery was empty now except for the grounds crew waiting impatiently to finish their work, and I realized I was utterly alone in a game I didn't know how to play against an opponent who had decades of practice destroying people. I drove home in a daze, the windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against the downpour, my mind replaying Victor's words and trying to find the trap I knew was hidden in his offer. Our house, the Cape Cod cottage Daniel had lovingly restored, looked different now, tainted somehow by the knowledge that it had never really been ours at all. Inside I found Daniel's coffee mug still in the sink from the morning he died, his reading glasses folded on the nightstand beside the biography of Lincoln he'd never finish, and I collapsed on our bed sobbing so hard I thought I might shatter into pieces too small to ever reassemble. But as the hours passed and the rain finally stopped, I felt something else rising through the grief, something sharp and cold that Daniel would have recognized as the stubborn determination that had gotten me through graduate school while working 3 jobs. Victor Carter thought I was just a scared widow he could manipulate and control, that I would sign whatever papers he put in front of me to keep my comfortable life intact. But he didn't know me at all. I opened my laptop and started searching for everything I could find about Victor Carter, about the Carter family empire, about the network of companies and properties and investments that formed his kingdom. What I found made my blood run cold, a pattern of hostile takeovers and destroyed competitors, of lawsuits settled quietly and accusers who disappeared from public life, of a man who had built billions on the backs of people he'd crushed without remorse. But I also found something else, buried in the archives of business journals from 6 years ago, an interview where Daniel Carter's name appeared in connection with his father's company, listed as Vice President of Acquisitions before his sudden resignation. Daniel had never told me he'd worked for Victor, had never mentioned being part of the business at all, and I felt the first stirrings of a horrible suspicion taking root in my chest. What else had Daniel kept from me? And more importantly, what had he known about his father that had made him run? By the time Margaret Hines arrived the next evening, precisely at 6 o'clock, I had made my decision. I would sign Victor's papers and enter his world, but not as the broken, grateful widow he expected me to be. I would get close to Victor Carter, learn his secrets, and find out what really happened to Daniel, because with every hour that passed I became more convinced that my husband's death was no accident. If Victor thought he was gaining control over me, he was about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous opponent is the one who has absolutely nothing left to lose. Margaret spread the contracts across my dining room table, her ice-blue eyes watching me with professional detachment, and I picked up the pen with a steady hand that surprised us both. What Victor Carter didn't know, what nobody knew yet, was that I had already started digging into Daniel's past, and I had found a locked box in our attic containing files and photographs and a thumb drive that my husband had hidden away like insurance. But here's what I need from you right now, because this story gets darker and more twisted than you can imagine. If you want to know what was on that thumb drive Daniel hid, If you want to see me walk into Victor Carter's world and start unraveling his empire from the inside, if you want to find out whether I'm strong enough to survive what's coming next, then you need to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because Chapter 2 drops soon and I promise you, everything you think you know is about to change. Comment below and tell me what you would do in my situation. Would you sign those contracts and play the long game, or would you walk away from everything and start over? Because I'm about to show you that sometimes the only way to escape a billionaire's trap is to become more dangerous than he ever expected. And trust me, Victor Carter has no idea what's about to hit him. This is just the beginning of how I took down a billionaire empire, and I'm taking you with me every step of the way. Did you know that the truly wealthy don't just buy things, they buy people? And I was about to discover exactly what Victor Carter thought he'd purchased. Margaret's car arrived at 7 the next morning, a sleek black sedan that whispered money and menace in equal measure. And I watched from my bedroom window as the driver waited with mechanical patience, knowing I had no choice but to get in. I'd barely slept, spending the night reading through Daniel's hidden files, discovering a husband I'd never really known, a man who'd documented his father's crimes with the precision of someone building a case. The thumb drive contained spreadsheets of shell companies and offshore accounts, photographs of meetings that should never have happened, and a video Daniel had recorded 3 weeks before he died where he looked directly at the camera and said, "Naomi, if you're watching this, it means he got to me, and you need to get out before he destroys you too." But I wasn't getting out, I was getting in. And as I climbed into Margaret's car wearing the designer suit she'd had delivered to my house at midnight, I felt like I was suiting up for war. The drive into downtown Seattle took 40 minutes, and Margaret didn't speak once, her fingers dancing across her tablet screen with the efficiency of someone for whom time literally equaled money. I watched the city transform from residential neighborhoods to gleaming towers of glass and steel, and somewhere high above us in the Carter Tower, Victor was waiting to begin whatever twisted game he'd designed. Margaret finally looked up as we pulled into an underground parking garage, her ice blue eyes assessing me with the clinical interest of someone evaluating livestock, and she said something that made my blood freeze. "Mr. Carter has cleared his calendar for you today, which is unprecedented. So I suggest you pay very close attention to everything he shows you, and remember that loyalty is the only currency that matters in this family." The way she emphasized family made it sound less like a blessing and more like a prison sentence. And I realized that Margaret wasn't just Victor's attorney. She was his true believer, someone who would do absolutely anything to protect his empire. The private elevator to the executive floor required Margaret's keycard and a retinal scan, which told me everything I needed to know about Victor's paranoia and security measures. We rode up in silence, the city dropping away beneath us until we were floating above the cloud layer, and I felt my ears pop from the rapid ascent to the 52nd floor. The elevator doors opened directly into a reception area that looked like it had been designed by someone who'd never heard the word warmth. All chrome and marble and floor-to-ceiling windows that made you feel exposed and insignificant. A receptionist who looked like she'd stepped out of a fashion magazine barely glanced at us, her perfectly manicured finger pointing toward massive double doors where Victor's office waited like the throne room of a particularly cruel king. Margaret knocked once, a sharp sound that echoed through the space, and Victor's voice called out, "Come in, Naomi, we have so much to discuss." Victor's office was less a workspace and more a monument to ego, stretching the entire length of the building's north face with views that encompassed everything from Puget Sound to the Cascade Mountains. He stood before those windows like a general surveying his conquered territory, his salt and pepper hair catching the morning light, his tailored navy suit fitting him like armor designed by Milan's best. When he turned to face me, his steel-gray eyes swept over my new appearance with obvious approval, and I felt my skin crawl at the possessive assessment in his gaze. "Much better," he said, gesturing to my suit like he'd personally dressed me, which in a way he had, and I realized this was just the first of many ways he would try to remake me into something he could control. Behind his desk, I noticed photographs I hadn't expected. Victor with presidents and tech giants, Victor cutting ribbons and shaking hands, and one older photo where a young Daniel stood beside his father, both wearing matching smiles that didn't reach their eyes, a moment of pretense captured forever in expensive framing. Victor moved around his desk with predatory grace, and I noticed for the first time how he controlled every space he occupied, how even his silence felt like a calculated tool. He explained that today I would attend 3 board meetings, meet with department heads, and accompany him to a lunch with investors who were considering a $500 million deal, all while presenting myself as his devoted daughter-in-law learning the family business. These people need to see you by my side. See that the Carter family is united and strong despite Daniel's tragic accident, Victor said, and the way he emphasized accident made it clear he knew I suspected the truth. I wanted to confront him right there, wanted to demand answers about my husband's death, but I thought about Daniel's hidden files and reminded myself that evidence mattered more than accusations. If I was going to destroy Victor Carter, I needed to be smarter and more patient than I'd ever been in my life. The first board meeting was a masterclass in intimidation. 15 senior executives who'd clearly been warned about my presence, their eyes tracking me like sharks scenting blood in the water. Victor introduced me with casual authority, his hand resting on my shoulder in what might have looked like paternal support, but felt like a handler controlling a show dog. I was seated directly beside him at the head of the table, a position that put me in everyone's line of sight and made it clear that I was Victor's project, his new acquisition to be displayed and integrated into the power structure. They discussed quarterly earnings and expansion strategies, using financial terminology that flew over my head, and I realized Victor had thrown me into the deep end deliberately, wanting me to feel helpless and dependent on him for guidance. But I'd taught high school students for 8 years, which meant I knew how to fake confidence I didn't feel. So I sat up straighter and started taking notes, watching the executives' reactions and learning who was afraid of Victor and who was simply in awe of his power. During a brief recess, I excused myself to the restroom and found myself standing before marble sinks wondering how my life had become this surreal nightmare. A woman entered behind me, her wild curly black hair and colorful scarf standing out dramatically against the sterile corporate environment, and she handed me a business card that read Elena Torres, investigative journalist, Seattle Tribune. My heart hammered as Elena leaned close and whispered, "I've been investigating Victor Carter for 3 years, and I knew your husband before he died. We were supposed to meet the night of his accident, and I think you're in serious danger." She pressed a second card into my hand, this one with just a phone number written in pen, and disappeared back into the hallway before I could respond. I stared at the cards in my shaking hands, Daniel's secret life expanding before me like a dark flower opening its petals, and I realized my husband hadn't been alone in his investigation of his father. I returned to the boardroom with my mind racing, trying to maintain my composure while Victor outlined the afternoon's schedule with the casual authority of someone who'd never been questioned in his life. The lunch meeting was held at an exclusive club that didn't have a sign because anyone who needed to know where it was already did. All dark wood paneling and leather chairs and waiters who moved like ghosts. Victor's investors were old money from California. 3 men in their 60s who discussed $250 million deals like I discussed grocery shopping. And I watched Victor transform into the perfect host, charming and brilliant and utterly convincing. But I noticed something else too. The way one of the investors kept glancing at me with something that looked like sympathy. The way another seemed uncomfortable when Victor's hand settled on my lower back. And I realized not everyone in Victor's world was blind to what he really was. When we returned to the office, Victor finally showed his cards. "You did well today, much better than I expected from a schoolteacher," Victor said once we were alone in his office, the sunset turning Seattle's skyline into gold and shadow behind him, and I felt the calculated insult land exactly where he'd intended. He poured himself a scotch from a crystal decanter that probably cost more than my car, didn't offer me any, and finally addressed what we'd both been dancing around all day. "I want you to understand something, Naomi. Daniel made his choice when he left this family, and that choice led directly to his death, so the question you need to ask yourself is whether you're going to make better choices or follow him into the ground." The casual cruelty of the statement stole my breath. Confirmation that Victor knew exactly what had happened to Daniel and felt absolutely no remorse. I gripped the arms of my chair to keep from lunging at him, forcing myself to remember the long game, the evidence I needed to gather, the justice Daniel deserved. Victor outlined his expectations with brutal clarity. I would move into the Carter family estate by the end of the week, attend every social function by his side, and gradually take on official roles within his companies, all while presenting the image of a grateful widow being rescued by her benevolent father-in-law. In exchange, I would keep my home, receive a generous monthly allowance, and gain access to a world most people only saw in magazines. What he didn't say but made abundantly clear through his possessive gaze and careful orchestration of every moment we'd spent together was that he expected me to become something more than just a daughter-in-law, something that made my stomach turn. I thought about Daniel's warning on the video, about Elena Torres and whatever investigation she'd been conducting, about the locked box still hidden in my attic containing evidence that could potentially destroy everything Victor had built. I stood up, smoothed my expensive new suit, and looked Victor directly in his cold gray eyes. "I understand perfectly, Victor," I said, using his first name deliberately, watching his eyebrow raise in surprise at my sudden boldness, and I let a small smile cross my face that I hoped conveyed cooperation while hiding my true intentions. I told him I would need 2 weeks to wrap up my teaching responsibilities and pack my things, a reasonable request he couldn't refuse without revealing the full extent of his control. As Margaret drove me home through the Seattle twilight, I pulled out Elena Torres's card and typed a careful message. "I have information about Daniel Carter. We need to meet somewhere safe, somewhere Victor doesn't own." The response came before we'd even reached my neighborhood, just an address and a time, and I felt the first genuine hope I'd experienced since Daniel's funeral. Victor thought he was pulling me into his web, thought he was isolating and controlling me, but what he didn't realize was that I'd spent the entire day watching and learning, identifying his weaknesses and finding the cracks in his perfect facade. But here's what you need to know before we continue, because the next chapter is where everything starts to unravel. If you're not already subscribed, hit that button now because I'm about to show you exactly what Daniel was investigating, what Elena Torres knows about Victor's criminal empire, and how I started building my own network of allies right under the billionaire's nose. Comment below and tell me what you think was on Daniel's thumb drive, because I promise you it's worse than you imagine. And I need to know if you're ready for how dark this story gets. We're about to dive into corporate espionage, hidden conspiracies, and discover that Daniel's death was just the tip of an iceberg that could sink Victor Carter's entire empire if I can expose it before he realizes I'm not the helpless victim he thinks I am. This is war now, and I'm learning to fight like a billionaire. So buckle up because Chapter 3 is going to blow your mind. What would you risk to learn the truth about someone you loved, even if that truth shattered everything you thought you knew? I stood in my attic at 2 a.m, surrounded by boxes of Daniel's belongings that suddenly felt like archaeological artifacts from a stranger's life, and carefully examined every file on the thumb drive he'd hidden away like a buried landmine. The spreadsheets detailed a network of shell companies Victor had used to funnel money from government contracts into offshore accounts, essentially stealing from taxpayers while building schools and hospitals that cut corners on safety to maximize profit. There were photographs of Victor meeting with officials who'd later approved those contracts, envelopes of cash changing hands in parking garages and private clubs, and email chains. That proved Daniel had tried to confront his father about the corruption before making the decision to document everything instead. The video Daniel had recorded was harder to watch, my husband's kind face filled with fear and determination as he explained how he'd planned to turn everything over to federal investigators, how he'd been building a case with someone he trusted, someone at the Seattle Tribune who specialized in exposing corrupt billionaires. Elena Torres's apartment was in a converted warehouse in Seattle's industrial district, the kind of place artists and journalists lived when they couldn't afford the gentrified neighborhoods, but needed the creative energy of the city. I'd taken 3 buses and walked the final mile to make sure no one followed me. Paranoia now my constant companion, since realizing Victor probably had people watching my every move. Elena opened the door wearing paint-stained jeans and a vintage band t-shirt, her wild curly hair pulled back with a pencil stuck through it, and her apartment looked exactly like I'd imagined an investigative journalist's space would. Walls covered with photographs and newspaper clippings connected by red string, stacks of file boxes labeled with dates and names, and a massive computer setup that looked like it belonged in a spy movie. She offered me coffee that was either extremely strong or had been sitting on the burner for days, and we sat at her cluttered kitchen table while I told her everything I'd discovered, and she revealed what Daniel had been helping her investigate before his death. Elena had been tracking Victor Carter's empire for 3 years, ever since a whistleblower from one of his construction companies had contacted her about safety violations that had led to a worker's death. That investigation had led her deeper into Victor's network, uncovering the shell companies and the government corruption. And eventually Daniel had reached out to her with insider information she could never have obtained otherwise. "Your husband was brave, Naomi," He knew what Victor was capable of, and he gathered evidence anyway because he couldn't stand watching his father destroy lives to make money, Elena said, pulling out her own files that corroborated everything on Daniel's thumb drive and added new dimensions to the conspiracy. There were connections to organized crime families who'd helped Victor eliminate business competitors. Offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands holding hundreds of millions in laundered money, and most damning of all, communications between Victor and a private security firm that specialized in making problems disappear permanently. I felt my hands shaking as I realized Daniel's brake failure probably hadn't been the tragic accident the police had ruled it, that my husband had been murdered by his own father to protect an empire built on crime. We need to be extremely careful because Victor has connections everywhere, police, judges, even some federal agents are on his payroll, Elena warned, her dark eyes intense as she explained the network of corruption that protected Victor's empire like layers of armor. She told me about other people who'd tried to expose Victor over the years. A business partner who'd committed suicide according to the official report, though his family insisted he'd never shown signs of depression. A city councilman who'd lost his re-election after mysterious allegations of misconduct surfaced right before he was set to vote against one of Victor's development projects. A journalist whose hard drive had been wiped and career destroyed by a lawsuit she couldn't afford to fight. The message was clear. Victor Carter didn't just fight his enemies, he destroyed them so thoroughly that others would think twice before challenging him. I thought about how he'd maneuvered me into his control with the trust documents and the financial threats, how he was slowly isolating me from my own life, and I realized I was already deeper into his trap than I'd understood. Elena proposed a plan that was either brilliant or insane, possibly both. I would continue playing my role as Victor's obedient daughter-in-law, moving into the Carter estate as he'd demanded, attending his meetings and social functions, all while secretly gathering additional evidence and feeding information back to Elena. She had contacts at the FBI who were building their own case against Victor, but needed the kind of insider testimony that only someone in his inner circle could provide. You would essentially be working undercover, which means you'd be in constant danger, but with the evidence Daniel already gathered combined with what you could access from inside Victor's world, we might actually be able to take him down, Elena said, and I saw the excitement in her face at the possibility of finally exposing a billionaire who'd evaded justice for decades. I thought about Daniel's warning on the video, about how he'd told me to run, to save myself, but I also thought about all the lives Victor had destroyed and all the people he would continue to hurt if someone didn't stop him. That night I barely slept, weighing the risks against my desire for justice, and by morning I'd made my decision. I would move into Victor's estate, I would become exactly what he wanted me to be on the surface, and I would destroy him from the inside. Elena set me up with a secure encrypted phone that looked identical to my regular one, showed me how to photograph documents without leaving evidence, and taught me the basics of what she called operational security, which sounded dramatic, but basically meant assuming Victor was always watching and learning to hide in plain sight. We established code phrases and dead-drop locations, ways to communicate that wouldn't raise suspicion if someone was monitoring my movements. As I left Elena's apartment with the morning sun just starting to warm Seattle's streets, I felt like a different person than the terrified widow who'd stood at Daniel's grave just days ago. I was still terrified, but now that fear was channeled into purpose, into a plan that might actually work if I was smart enough and brave enough to pull it off. Victor's estate was a sprawling compound in Medina, the exclusive community across Lake Washington, where tech billionaires built their modern fortresses, and pulling through the security gates felt like entering a different country entirely. The main house was a masterpiece of contemporary architecture, all glass and steel and impossible angles, sitting on 5 acres of meticulously landscaped grounds that probably required a team of gardeners to maintain. Margaret Hines was waiting at the front entrance with an assistant I didn't recognize, both women dressed like they were attending a board meeting rather than welcoming a new resident, and I realized this was how Victor's world operated. Everything formal, everything controlled, nothing left to chance or spontaneity. My belongings had already been moved into a guest suite on the 2nd floor, a space larger than my entire former house, decorated in shades of white and gray that felt cold despite the luxury. Through my windows I could see the lake, and beyond it the Seattle skyline where Victor's tower dominated the view, a constant reminder of his power and reach. That first dinner at the estate was a performance I hadn't rehearsed for, just Victor and me at opposite ends of a table designed for 20, served by staff who moved through the dining room like they'd been trained to be invisible. Victor spoke about his plans for my integration into the company, dropping names of senators and CEOs like they were casual acquaintances, painting a picture of the life I could have if I embraced my position as a Carter. But between the polite conversation and the expensive wine, I caught glimpses of the real Victor. The way he snapped at a server who brought the wrong vintage, the cold calculation in his eyes when he discussed a competitor's recent bankruptcy, the possessive way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. After dinner, he showed me his private study, a room I hadn't been allowed to enter during my earlier visit, filled with rare books and art that belonged in museums. And I realized this was a test to see if I would snoop, if I could be trusted with access to his inner sanctum. I passed his test by showing polite interest but not touching anything, by asking intelligent questions about his book collection but not being too curious about his files, and I saw his approval in the slight smile that crossed his face. "You're smarter than Daniel gave you credit for. He always said you were too innocent for this world, too gentle," Victor said, and hearing him speak about my husband with such casual dismissal made me want to scream. But I smiled instead, played the role of the grateful student learning from a master, and filed away every detail of the study for later. The safe behind the Picasso sketch, the computer system that probably contained files Elena would kill to access, the way certain books seemed less dusty than others, as if they'd been recently handled. Victor walked me back to my suite, his hand on my lower back again in that possessive gesture I was learning to hate, and at my door he leaned close enough that I could smell his expensive cologne mixed with the scotch he'd been drinking. "I'm glad you're here, Naomi. I think we're going to build something remarkable together, something Daniel never had the vision or the courage to achieve," Victor said, and the implications in his voice made my skin crawl even as I forced myself to maintain my composure. I thanked him for his hospitality, wished him good night, and closed the door between us, finally allowing myself to breathe once I was alone. The suite felt like a gilded cage, beautiful and luxurious and utterly imprisoning. And I found myself standing at the window staring at the lights of Seattle across the dark water, wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake. Then I remembered Daniel's face on that video, remembered the spreadsheets documenting Victor's crimes, remembered all the people who'd suffered because no one had been brave enough to stop him. I pulled out the encrypted phone Elena had given me and sent a simple message. "I'm inside, let's burn his empire to the ground." Elena's response came immediately, just 3 words that made my heart race. "Welcome to war." I spent the rest of that night planning my next moves, identifying what information I needed to access and how I could get it without raising Victor's suspicions. Tomorrow I would attend my first charity gala as Victor's official escort, an event where Seattle's elite would gather to congratulate themselves on their philanthropy while Victor networked and consolidated power. I would smile and play my part perfectly, the grieving widow grateful for her father-in-law's support, while secretly photographing donor lists and recording conversations and building the case that would eventually destroy everything Victor had built. The game had truly begun, and I was no longer playing defense. But before I show you what happened at that gala, where I met some of Victor's most dangerous allies and discovered just how deep his corruption went, I need you to do something for me. Smash that subscribe button and turn on those notifications because Chapter 4 is where the gloves come off and I start gathering the evidence that will bring down a billionaire. Comment below and tell me which of Victor's crimes you think is the most damning because trust me, we've only scratched the surface of how evil this man really is. Share this story with someone who loves a good revenge plot because I promise you, by the time we reach the end, Victor Carter is going to regret the day he ever threatened me. The war is just beginning. And I'm learning that sometimes the best way to fight a monster is to become something he never saw coming. Have you ever walked into a room full of people who could destroy your life with a single phone call and smiled like you belonged there? The Grand Cascade Ballroom glittered with the kind of wealth that most people only see in movies. 500 of Seattle's most powerful individuals gathered under crystal chandeliers worth more than my childhood home, and I stood at the entrance wearing a gown that cost more than a year of my teacher's salary while Victor's hand rested possessively on my waist. Margaret had selected the dress, a deep emerald silk that hugged every curve and made me look like I'd been born into this world rather than dragged into it against my will. And I caught my reflection in the mirrored walls wondering who this woman was who looked so confident and composed. Victor leaned close to whisper the names of people I needed to remember. Governor Richardson, who'd pushed through zoning changes for Victor's waterfront development, Senator Hayes, whose campaign Victor had funded for 3 election cycles, and Carolyn Weston, the tech CEO, whose company had received suspiciously favorable treatment in city contract bids. Every introduction was a revelation of corruption, every handshake a connection in the network I was learning to map. The evening was a masterclass in how power really worked, not through obvious displays of force, but through subtle conversations over champagne and strategic positioning at dinner tables. Victor introduced me as his beloved daughter-in-law who was bravely learning the family business after her tragic loss, and I watched person after person offer rehearsed condolences while their eyes assessed whether I was a potential ally or threat. I played my role perfectly, demure but intelligent, grieving but resilient, exactly the kind of woman these people expected to see hanging on Victor's arm. But while I smiled and made small talk, I was using the encrypted phone hidden in my clutch to photograph name tags and document who sat with whom, building Elena's investigation one piece of evidence at a time. During a brief moment when Victor was pulled away by a technology mogul wanting to discuss an acquisition, I found myself approached by someone I hadn't expected to see. James Whitmore, Victor's head of security, stood before me with a champagne flute that looked ridiculous in his large military-trained hands, his crew-cut and watchful brown eyes marking him instantly as someone who didn't belong in this world of soft executives and politicians. "Mrs. Carter, I wanted to offer my personal condolences about Daniel. He was a good man who didn't deserve what happened to him," James said, and something in the way he emphasized what happened made my pulse quicken with the possibility that not everyone in Victor's inner circle was completely loyal. I thanked him carefully, watching his face for any sign of what he really meant, and he glanced around before adding in a voice so low I almost missed it. "Your husband came to me 2 months before he died, asked me questions about Victor's security protocols and offshore communications. I told him I couldn't help him, but I've regretted that decision every day since." Before I could respond, Victor materialized beside us like he had a sixth sense for conversations happening without his approval, and James smoothly transitioned into discussing updates about estate security while I processed this revelation about a potential ally inside Victor's fortress. The dinner portion of the evening seated me between a hedge fund manager who spent 20 minutes explaining why poor people deserve to be poor and a philanthropist whose foundation I later learned was primarily used for tax evasion, and I smiled through both conversations while dying a little inside. Victor held court at the center of the head table, telling stories that made powerful people laugh and hang on his every word, and I watched him work the room with the skill of someone who'd spent decades perfecting the art of manipulation. During dessert, Carolyn Weston leaned across the table to tell me how lucky I was to have Victor's protection, how many young widows would have been lost without such strong family support, and the way she said it made me wonder if she knew exactly what kind of protection Victor was really offering. I excused myself to the restroom, desperately needing a break from the performance, and found myself face to face with someone who would change everything. In the bathroom lounge, a woman I'd never seen before was reapplying lipstick with hands that shook slightly, and when our eyes met in the mirror I saw fear that matched my own. She introduced herself as Rachel Morrison, wife of one of Victor's business partners, and after glancing under the stall doors to ensure we were alone, she grabbed my wrist with desperate strength. "Get away from Victor Carter while you still can. My husband thought he could manage their partnership, and now Victor owns him completely, controls every decision, threatens him constantly, and I've watched the man I married become a shell of himself," Rachel whispered urgently, her makeup perfect but unable to hide the exhaustion in her eyes. She told me about other families Victor had destroyed, business partners who disagreed with his methods and found themselves facing manufactured scandals or unexplained financial disasters, always careful to leave no evidence of his involvement. I wanted to tell her about my investigation, about Elena and the plan to expose Victor, but operational security meant I could only thank her for the warning and watch her leave with slumped shoulders that spoke of defeat and resignation. I returned to the ballroom with my composure barely intact, and Victor immediately pulled me onto the dance floor, where a string quartet was playing something elegant and haunting. His hand on my back felt like ownership, his steel gray eyes watching my face with an intensity that made me feel like a butterfly pinned under glass, and when he pulled me closer than appropriate, he whispered, "You're doing beautifully tonight. Everyone is quite taken with you. Several people have already commented on what a perfect addition you are to the Carter family legacy." The way he said legacy made it clear he wasn't just talking about business, and I felt my stomach turn as I realized Victor's interest in me went far beyond controlling Daniel's widow or securing family assets. He was grooming me to become something more, a companion or worse, and the thought made me want to run screaming from the ballroom. But I thought about Daniel's files, about Rachel Morrison's warning, about all the people Victor had destroyed, and I forced myself to smile and follow his lead across the dance floor while secretly planning his destruction. The rest of the evening blurred together in a parade of introductions and veiled threats disguised as friendly advice. And by the time Victor's driver took us back to the estate, I felt exhausted from maintaining my performance. In the car, Victor reviewed my conduct like a coach after a game, praising my poise and intelligence while subtly correcting moments where I'd been too quiet or not engaged enough with certain key players. Margaret called with follow-up items, charity boards I would be joining, lunch meetings Victor had scheduled with potential business partners who wanted to meet me, and I realized my life was being systematically reconstructed according to Victor's design. Back in my gilded cage of a suite, I finally allowed myself to collapse, pulling out the encrypted phone to upload the photographs and notes I'd gathered. Elena's response came quickly with locations and connections I'd missed, dots being connected in real time, and she added something that made my blood run cold. "We've identified a pattern. Victor eliminates problems during or right after major public events when he has documented alibis. You need to be extremely careful." That night I couldn't sleep, kept awake by Rachel Morrison's haunted eyes and Elena's warning about Victor's pattern of elimination during public events, and I found myself reviewing everything Daniel had documented with new understanding. Daniel had died 3 days after attending a charity auction with his father, an event where Victor had been surrounded by witnesses all night while my husband's car mysteriously malfunctioned on his drive home. I pulled up news archives and found the pattern Elena had mentioned. The business partner's suicide had occurred the day after a company celebration. The councilman's scandal had broken during a city fundraiser Victor hosted. The journalist's career destruction had begun at a press conference where Victor appeared generous and cooperative. He created alibis through visibility, using public events to establish his presence while his hired problem solvers did the actual dirty work, and I realized with crystalline clarity that I was currently living in his house, completely within his control, during what would likely be a very public period of events and appearances. The next morning brought a surprise that shifted everything. James Whitmore appeared at my suite door during breakfast, his expression carefully neutral as he informed me that Victor had been called away on urgent business in Los Angeles and would be gone for 3 days. He asked me to ensure your safety and comfort during his absence, Mrs. Carter, and to remind you that you have access to the entire estate except his private office, which remains locked for security purposes, James said. But the way his eyes held mine made me wonder if he was really delivering a different message entirely. Once the housekeeping staff cleared my breakfast tray, and I was alone, I received a text from an unknown number. Victor's security system has a 2-minute lag when switching between camera feeds. Gaps occur at 3:17 a.m., 7:33 a.m., 11:49 a.m., 4:05 p.m., and 8:21 p.m. daily. His office door lock is a Medico Maxim requiring a bump key I can provide. Daniel would want you to find what's hidden there. The message deleted itself as I watched, and I realized James Whitmore had just handed me the keys to Victor's kingdom. I spent the day pretending everything was normal, attending a lunch meeting Margaret had arranged with a women's leadership organization where I was being positioned as a future board member. But my mind was racing with possibilities and dangers. Elena confirmed through our secure channel that Victor's trip to Los Angeles was real and that he was meeting with Chinese investors about a development deal, giving us a genuine window of opportunity. That evening at exactly 8:21 p.m., I stood outside Victor's private office with the bump key James had left in a false electrical panel, my heart hammering so hard I thought the security cameras would pick up the vibration. The lock clicked open easier than I'd expected, and I stepped into Victor's inner sanctum knowing that what I found in the next 2 minutes could either save my life or end it. But what I discovered in Victor's office changed everything I thought I knew about Daniel's death, about Victor's empire, and about just how far this conspiracy really went. And I'm going to show you exactly what I found in Chapter 5. If you're not subscribed yet, you need to hit that button right now, because the next chapter reveals secrets that connect to the highest levels of government and prove that Victor Carter is far more dangerous than even Elena suspected. Comment below and tell me if you think James Whitmore can be trusted, or if this is an elaborate trap Victor has set for me. Because I need to know if I'm being smart or walking into my own funeral. Share this with anyone who loves political thrillers, because what's coming next is going to expose corruption that reaches way beyond one billionaire's crimes. The office door is open, the cameras are on a lag, and I'm about to find evidence that will either destroy Victor Carter or get me killed trying. What would you do if you had 2 minutes to find evidence that could topple an empire, knowing that discovery meant certain death? Victor's office looked different at night. Shadows transforming the expensive furniture and art into something sinister and threatening. And I moved through the space with my encrypted phone's camera ready and my pulse thundering in my ears. The safe behind the Picasso sketch was my primary target, but James's message had been specific about something else. Check the false bottom in the third desk drawer. That's where Victor keeps his insurance. I pulled open drawers with hands steadier than I expected, finding typical office supplies and business files until the third drawer revealed what looked like a normal collection of fountain pens and leather portfolios. But when I pressed the back corner as James had instructed, the entire bottom panel lifted to reveal a hidden compartment containing 3 thumb drives, a burner phone, and a leather-bound journal that looked like it had been maintained for decades. I photographed everything rapidly, conscious that my 2-minute window was evaporating, then carefully removed the journal and began photographing pages as fast as my phone's camera could capture them. The journal was a record of every illegal deal, every bribe, every threat Victor had made over 30 years of building his empire, written in his own hand like some psychopath's trophy collection. There were entries about the construction worker's death that Elena had investigated. Morrison's crew chief refused the cheaper materials, had to arrange an accident to remove him and install someone more cooperative, cost an additional $50K, but saved $2M on the project. There were details about political payoffs, amounts and dates and specific favors received, senators and governors and judges all listed with their prices clearly noted. But what made my blood freeze was an entry from 3 months ago, dated 2 weeks before Daniel's death. Diaz become a liability, met with that Tribune journalist again despite my warnings, tried reasoning with him, but he's stubborn like his mother was. Margaret is researching our options for permanent solutions while maintaining plausible deniability. I photographed that page 3 times to ensure Elena would have crystal clear evidence, my hands shaking now with rage and grief at seeing my husband's murder planned in his father's handwriting. I had 90 seconds left before the camera feeds rotated back, and I was about to close the journal when I saw entries from just last week that made me realize Victor's crimes went even deeper than government corruption and murder. He was planning something massive, a development deal in Los Angeles that involved demolishing affordable housing to build luxury condos. Except the demolition was scheduled to happen before residents were given proper notice or relocation assistance, essentially making thousands of people homeless to maximize his profit margin. The Chinese investors he was meeting with right now were fronts for a money laundering operation. Their investment would flow through Victor's shell companies and emerge clean on the other side, and Victor's journal noted that, once the LA deal closes, we'll have enough offshore capital to expand the model to 5 more cities. Displacement is profitable if you control the municipal approval process. I photographed those pages too, understanding that Elena now had evidence of conspiracy, fraud, murder, and plans for future crimes that could put Victor away for multiple lifetimes if we could get this information to the right authorities without being killed first. With 30 seconds remaining, I carefully returned everything to the hidden compartment exactly as I'd found it, my hands moving with desperate precision to ensure Victor would never know his secrets had been compromised. The journal's leather cover had been positioned at a specific angle, the thumb drives in a particular order, and I replicated everything while mentally screaming at time to slow down. The drawer slid closed with a soft click that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet office, and I moved quickly to Victor's computer system, knowing I was pushing my luck, but unable to resist the temptation of what his files might contain. The system was password protected with biometric authentication, but James had included a note about Victor's backup password written on a sticky note inside his desk calendar, the kind of security flaw that genius criminals somehow always made. I typed in Empire 2024, and the screen unlocked, revealing a desktop organized with the precision of someone who controlled every aspect of his life through digital files and encrypted communications. I inserted a thumb drive Elena had prepared, a device that would clone Victor's entire system while leaving no trace of the intrusion, and watched the progress bar crawl across the screen with agonizing slowness. The camera feeds would rotate back in less than 30 seconds, and the clone was only 60% complete, and I found myself bargaining with a god I wasn't sure I believed in to just give me a little more time. At 20 seconds, the office door handle rattled, and my heart stopped as I realized someone was trying to enter, and I yanked the thumb drive out at 85%, probably corrupting files, but unable to risk being caught standing at Victor's computer with his entire criminal empire being copied. The system went to sleep mode automatically, and I dove toward the Picasso sketch, pretending to examine it just as the door opened and James Whitmore stood there with an expression that could have meant anything. "Mrs. Carter, is everything all right?" "I saw the office light was on," James said carefully, and I watched his eyes scan the room, assessing what I'd been doing, whether I'd been successful, and if I'd covered my tracks adequately. I told him I'd been unable to sleep and had been wandering the estate, that I'd found the office door ajar, which seemed strange, and I'd entered to investigate, wondering if there was a security breach. The lie came easily, supported by genuine fear that made my voice shake convincingly, and I watched James decide whether to believe me or report this incident to Victor immediately. Something shifted in his expression, a decision being made, and he stepped fully into the office to check that everything was secure while I held my breath, waiting to see if he'd notice anything out of place. He examined the desk briefly, his eyes lingering on the drawer I'd searched, then turned to me with a nod that seemed to convey far more than his words. "Everything appears fine. I'll escort you back to your suite and have maintenance check the door lock in the morning. Mr. Carter wouldn't want you worried about security issues while he's away." Walking back to my suite with James beside me, the thumb drive burning in my pocket like stolen fire, I took a calculated risk. "Thank you for the information about the security system gaps, James. Daniel would be glad to know his father has people around him who remember what integrity looks like." I watched him stiffen, his jaw clenching, and for a moment I thought I'd miscalculated, exposed myself to someone who would immediately call Victor and report my activities. But then his shoulders relaxed slightly, and he said so quietly I almost missed it, "Your husband was the best person I ever worked for, and what happened to him was wrong. If you're trying to make that right, then I'll do what I can to help without getting us both killed." We had reached my suite, and he handed me a business card with just a phone number, no name or identification, and told me to call that number if I ever felt unsafe or needed assistance. I took the card feeling like I'd just gained the most valuable ally possible. Someone inside Victor's fortress who had access and knowledge, and apparently a conscience that Victor's money hadn't completely purchased. Inside my suite, I finally allowed myself to collapse, the adrenaline crash hitting me so hard I could barely stand. But I forced myself to upload everything to Elena immediately through our secure channel. The photos of Victor's journal, the partially corrupted clone of his computer files, and notes about what I'd found and how James had helped all went into our shared encrypted storage. Elena's response came within minutes, a string of exclamations and confirmation that this was the smoking gun we needed, evidence so damning that even Victor's expensive lawyers and political connections wouldn't be able to save him. But she also sent a warning that chilled me despite the evidence. "This is enough to destroy him, which means if he discovers what you've done, he won't hesitate to eliminate you like he did Daniel. We need to move quickly but carefully. One wrong step and you're dead." I looked at Daniel's photograph on my nightstand, at his kind face and gentle eyes, and I made him a silent promise that his death would be avenged, that Victor would pay for every life he'd destroyed, and that I would survive long enough to watch his empire burn. The next 2 days passed in a strange state of suspended tension. Victor still in Los Angeles while I attended scheduled appointments and played the role of devoted daughter-in-law, all while Elena worked with her FBI contacts to build an airtight case using the evidence I'd provided. She informed me that Daniel had actually been working with federal investigators before his death, that he'd been prepared to testify against his father before the brake failure that wasn't an accident, and that the FBI had been forced to close their investigation when their key witness died. Now they had a second chance, evidence even stronger than what Daniel had provided, and a witness inside Victor's own home who could testify about current criminal activities. Elena explained that they were preparing to move quickly, obtaining warrants and building a case that would hit Victor from multiple directions simultaneously, so he couldn't manipulate his way out of justice. But first they needed one more piece of evidence: Victor's offshore account numbers and the names of his shell company officers, information that would allow federal prosecutors to freeze his assets and prevent him from fleeing the country. That information existed in one place according to Daniel's notes: a safety deposit box at a private bank in the Cayman Islands where Victor kept physical copies of everything as insurance against his digital files being compromised. Elena's FBI contact confirmed that they could obtain the evidence through international cooperation treaties. But it would take weeks to navigate the legal process. Weeks we might not have if Victor discovered the investigation. There was another option, riskier but faster. Victor kept the access codes to that safety deposit box somewhere in his estate, probably in the safe I'd noticed behind the Picasso sketch, and if I could photograph those codes, then federal agents could move immediately. I told Elena I would try, fully aware that accessing Victor's safe was exponentially more dangerous than searching his desk, and she responded with instructions for contacting James to see if he could help. That evening I called the number James had given me, and his voice was carefully neutral when he answered. "Mrs. Carter, how can I assist you?" James agreed to meet me the following morning when Victor would still be in Los Angeles, and I spent that night reviewing everything Daniel had written about his father's safe, trying to prepare myself for what felt increasingly like a suicide mission. But I thought about the families Victor planned to displace in Los Angeles, about all the lives he'd destroyed over 3 decades, about Daniel dying alone in that car accident that was really murder, and I knew I had to see this through regardless of the personal cost. Victor Carter had spent his entire life believing that money and power made him untouchable, that he could commit any crime without consequence. And I was about to prove that even billionaires could be brought down by the truth. If you want to see me crack Victor's safe and obtain the evidence that will finally destroy him, if you want to know whether James and I survive what comes next, then you absolutely need to subscribe right now, because Chapter 6 is where everything explodes. Comment below and tell me if you think James is genuinely on my side or if this is Victor's trap closing around me. Because the next 48 hours will determine whether I become the hero who took down a corrupt billionaire or just another victim of his empire. Share this story with everyone you know, because we're about to expose crimes that reach into the highest levels of power, and I promise you the evidence I'm about to find will shock you. The safe is waiting, the codes are inside, and I'm running out of time before Victor returns. Have you ever stood before something you knew could explode your entire world and decided to open it anyway? James met me at dawn in Victor's study, his military bearing somehow softer in the early morning light, and he placed a small leather case on the desk between us containing tools I recognized from heist movies. A stethoscope, some kind of electronic device with LED displays, and what looked like a jeweler's precision instruments. Your husband asked me to teach him safe cracking once, said he wanted to understand his father's security systems. I refused then, and I've regretted it every day since Daniel died, James said, his voice rough with guilt, and I watched him open the leather case with hands that had clearly done this before. He explained that Victor's safe was a Centurion 900 with both mechanical and electronic locks, normally impossible to crack, but James had installed the system and knew its vulnerabilities, specifically a maintenance override that Victor didn't know existed because he'd never bothered to read the technical specifications. We had maybe 3 hours before the household staff began their morning routines. 3 hours to access decades of Victor's most protected secrets without leaving any trace of our intrusion. James moved the Picasso sketch aside with surprising gentleness considering what we were about to do, revealing a steel safe door built directly into the wall, its electronic keypad glowing with soft blue light that looked almost alive in the dim study. He attached the electronic device to the keypad, explaining that it would cycle through possible combinations while the mechanical stethoscope would let him hear the tumblers falling into place, a combination of old and new techniques that felt appropriate for accessing secrets spanning multiple decades. I watched the LED display flicker through number sequences while James pressed the stethoscope against the safe door, his eyes closed in concentration, and I found myself holding my breath as minutes stretched into eternity. The household was silent around us, everyone sleeping except the 2 people attempting to crack open the heart of Victor Carter's empire, and I felt the weight of what we were doing settle over me like a physical presence. 27 minutes later, something clicked, a sound so subtle I almost missed it, but James's eyes opened with an expression of satisfaction mixed with apprehension. "We're in, but Mrs. Carter, you need to understand that once we open this, there's no going back. Victor will eventually discover the intrusion, even if we're careful. And when he does, he'll know someone inside his organization betrayed him," James said, giving me one final chance to walk away before we crossed this irreversible line. I thought about Rachel Morrison's warning at the gala, about all the people Victor had destroyed, about Daniel's murder spelled out in his father's own handwriting, and I reached past James to turn the safe handle myself, accepting full responsibility for whatever consequences followed. The heavy door swung open with a whisper of expensive engineering, and inside I found exactly what Elena had predicted. Rows of document folders, several external hard drives, and a small metal box that looked like it contained something especially important. I began photographing everything systematically, folder labels revealing a hierarchy of crimes. Offshore holdings Cayman, political contributions unreported, contractor elimination Morrison case, and worst of all, contingency plans family members. That last folder made my hands shake as I photographed page after page of documents detailing how Victor had planned for the possibility that his own son might betray him. Surveillance Daniel had been under for months before his death. Communications Daniel had no idea were being monitored. There were transcripts of phone calls between Daniel and Elena, proof that Victor had known about the investigation long before he'd arranged the break failure, and a memo to Margaret Hines with instructions for permanent resolution of the Daniel problem while maintaining complete deniability. I had to stop reading and just photograph because the content was making me nauseous, seeing my husband's murder planned with the same casual efficiency Victor applied to his business deals. The small metal box required a separate key that James found hidden behind a false panel inside the safe. Victor's paranoia creating layers of security even within his most secure space. And when we opened it, I understood why. Inside were 3 passports under different names with Victor's photo, each from a different country, along with account numbers for banks in Switzerland, Panama, and Singapore, and a handwritten list of what appeared to be contacts in countries without extradition treaties to the United States. This was Victor's escape plan, the proof that he'd always known his empire was built on crimes that could eventually catch up with him, and he'd prepared multiple escape routes for when that day came. Elena would later confirm that the account numbers represented over $800 million in hidden assets, money that had been stolen, laundered, and secreted away beyond the reach of any legitimate authority, a fortune that Victor could access and disappear with if he ever felt threatened. But the most devastating evidence was on one of the external hard drives, and James had brought a laptop to view the drive's contents before we photographed them, wanting to ensure we captured everything of value. The drive contained video files dated over 15 years, and when James opened the first one, we both froze in shock. Victor had recorded his meetings, every bribe and threat and conspiracy planned in his office, apparently as insurance against his co-conspirators ever turning on him. I watched politicians and judges and business leaders agreeing to illegal schemes, their faces and voices crystal clear, their crimes documented in high definition by the man who'd orchestrated them. There were videos of Victor threatening people, his charming facade dropping to reveal the cold predator beneath, and I photographed the directory of files, knowing that each video represented another life destroyed and another count in the criminal case we were building. We were so focused on the hard drives that we almost missed the sound of a car approaching the estate, tires on gravel carrying through the quiet morning, and James's head snapped up with an expression of pure panic. "That's Victor's car. He's come back early. We have maybe 2 minutes before he reaches the study," James said. And suddenly we were moving with desperate speed to return everything exactly as we'd found it. Folders went back in precise order, hard drives replaced at specific angles, the metal box relocked and repositioned, every second counting as we heard a car door slam and voices in the entrance hall. James worked the safe closed and reattached the Picasso sketch while I grabbed the laptop and tool case, and we were heading for the study's side door when we heard Victor's voice in the hallway just outside, talking with Margaret about the Los Angeles deal and asking if everything had been quiet during his absence. James pushed me through the side door that led to a service hallway just as we heard the main study door opening, and we pressed ourselves against the wall in the narrow corridor, holding our breath while Victor entered the room we'd just fled. His voice carried clearly as he told Margaret to schedule meetings and complained about the flight from Los Angeles, and I felt James's hand over my mouth warning me to stay absolutely silent as we heard Victor moving around the study. There was a terrible moment where his footsteps approached the Picasso sketch, and I was certain he would notice something wrong with how it hung or sense that his safe had been violated. But then his phone rang, and he was distracted by a call from his Chinese investors. We used that moment to move down the service hallway, James guiding me through corridors I hadn't known existed, servant passages that honeycombed the mansion allowing staff to move unseen, and we finally emerged in a storage room near the kitchen where James pulled me into a supplies closet and closed the door. We stayed in that closet for 15 minutes that felt like hours, James's phone tracking Victor's movements through the house via the security system, and I realized he had far more access to the estate systems than Victor probably knew. When the coast was finally clear, James walked me back to my suite through the regular hallways, both of us pretending this was a normal morning interaction if anyone saw us, and at my door he handed me a USB drive. I copied everything from the hard drives while you were photographing documents. This is insurance in case something happens to the evidence you gathered. Hide it somewhere Victor would never think to look, James said, and I understood he was preparing for the possibility that one or both of us might not survive what came next. I took the drive feeling the weight of all the evidence we'd just stolen. Crimes spanning decades now compressed into a few pieces of portable electronics, and I met James's eyes with gratitude I couldn't adequately express. Inside my suite, I immediately uploaded everything to Elena using our secure connection, and her response was a single word followed by multiple exclamation points. Gotcha! She explained that the evidence I'd provided was overwhelming, that her FBI contacts were preparing to move within 48 hours, that they had enough to arrest Victor on multiple federal charges including murder, conspiracy, money laundering, and RICO violations that would put him away for multiple lifetimes. But she also warned that the next 2 days were the most dangerous I would face, that Victor might sense something was wrong, that I needed to be absolutely careful and perfect in maintaining my cover until federal agents arrived with arrest warrants. I looked at the calendar on my phone and realized that in 48 hours Victor was scheduled to host a fundraiser at the estate, a major event with politicians and business leaders attending, exactly the kind of public alibi he preferred when eliminating problems. The timing felt too coincidental to be accidental, and I wondered if Victor had somehow sensed my investigation and was planning to remove me the same way he'd removed Daniel. That evening at dinner, Victor seemed different, his steel-gray eyes watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl, and I wondered if he'd somehow discovered the safe had been opened or if I was just paranoid from the morning's close call. He asked pointed questions about how I'd spent my days while he was gone, whether I'd been comfortable in the estate, if I'd explored the house or felt the need to go into any rooms that were off-limits. I answered carefully, maintaining my cover as the grieving widow grateful for his support, but I could feel him testing me, looking for cracks in my performance. Margaret joined us for coffee after dinner, and she brought contracts for me to sign, charitable foundation board positions and company officer roles that would legally tie me deeper into the Carter empire. I signed them with a steady hand, knowing that in 2 days none of these contracts would matter because Victor would be in federal custody and his entire empire would be frozen under RICO asset seizure laws. But you need to know what happened in those final 48 hours before the FBI arrived, how Victor's trap closed, and how I barely escaped with my life. So hit that subscribe button immediately, because Chapter 7 is the most intense yet. Comment below and tell me if you think Victor knows what I did or if I'm successfully maintaining my cover. Because the fundraiser is coming, and I have a terrible feeling that Victor is planning something that will change everything. Share this with anyone who's ever wanted to see a powerful person finally face justice, because we are so close to bringing down Victor Carter. But first I have to survive his final play. The evidence is uploaded, the FBI is moving, and I'm living in the house of a murderer who might know I've betrayed him. What does a predator do when it senses the trap closing around it? The 48 hours before the fundraiser passed with agonizing slowness, every interaction with Victor feeling like a test I might fail, every casual question potentially hiding accusations I couldn't answer. He insisted I accompany him to meetings downtown, introduced me to more business partners and political allies, and I played my role perfectly while secretly photographing every document I could access and recording conversations on the device Elena had provided. But something had shifted in Victor's demeanor, a calculation in his eyes when he thought I wasn't watching, and James confirmed through our covert communication that Victor had ordered additional security for the fundraiser and had been making encrypted phone calls from his car where the estate systems couldn't record them. Elena's FBI contacts were preparing to execute arrest warrants the morning after the fundraiser, timing their move to gather as many of Victor's associates as possible at one location. But I was beginning to suspect that Victor was planning something for the event itself, something that would eliminate me before federal agents could arrive. The day of the fundraiser arrived with perfect Seattle weather, and the estate transformed into something from a magazine spread, white tents erected on the lawns, catering trucks arriving with food prepared by celebrity chefs, and a string quartet setting up on the terrace overlooking the lake. Margaret orchestrated everything with military precision, and I noticed she seemed more attentive than usual, her ice blue eyes tracking my movements as I moved through the preparations in the gown she'd selected for me. A stunning sapphire silk that felt more like a costume than clothing. Victor was charm itself all morning, complimenting my appearance and thanking me for supporting the family during this important event. But when he took my hand to examine how his mother's diamond bracelet looked on my wrist, his grip tightened just slightly too hard, a subtle message that I was his possession to display and control. I smiled through the discomfort and excused myself to finish getting ready, sending Elena a coded message that something felt wrong, that I needed to be prepared for Victor to make his move tonight. Elena responded immediately, her message coded but clear. FBI agents would be at the event undercover as catering staff and security. They would move in if I gave them a signal that I was in danger. But I needed to be absolutely certain before exposing their presence, because if Victor discovered federal agents on site, he might activate his escape plan using the Cayman Islands accounts and disappear forever. She also warned me that Daniel's autopsy had been reviewed by a federal forensic team, and they'd found evidence of sedatives in his blood that the original medical examiner had missed, proof that Daniel had been drugged before his car was tampered with, making his murder even more premeditated and vicious than we'd realized. I read that message 3 times, rage and grief washing over me in waves, and I made a decision. Tonight Victor Carter would confess to everything. I would record him admitting to Daniel's murder and all his other crimes, and I would personally hand that confession to the FBI agents waiting to arrest him. Guests began arriving at 7, and I descended the curved staircase to find 300 of Seattle's elite gathered in Victor's home. The same crowd from the gala plus additional politicians and business leaders who'd flown in from across the country. I identified the undercover FBI agents immediately despite their perfect catering uniforms and security badges. Something in their watchful professionalism marking them as different from Victor's regular staff, and I felt marginally safer knowing they were positioned throughout the estate. Victor claimed me the moment I reached the bottom of the stairs, his arm around my waist in a possessive gesture that everyone read as paternal support, but felt like ownership. And we moved through the crowd together as he introduced me repeatedly as my dear daughter-in-law who's become like a real daughter to me. The way he emphasized real daughter made several guests exchange uncomfortable glances, and I realized others were seeing what I'd been fighting against. Victor's interest in me went far beyond familial concern. Midway through the evening, Victor asked me to join him in his study for a private moment, and every instinct screamed that this was the trap I'd been anticipating. James caught my eye from across the room, his expression broadcasting a warning I couldn't ignore, but refusing Victor's request would confirm his suspicions, if he had any. I followed him through the crowd, up the stairs, down the hallway I'd traveled so many times in secret, and into his study where this entire investigation had begun. He closed the door with a soft click that sounded like a prison cell locking, and when he turned to face me his charming facade had completely dropped, revealing the cold predator I'd always known lurked beneath. Naomi, I'm going to ask you a question, and I strongly suggest you answer honestly because I already know the truth, and I'm simply seeing if you have the courage to admit what you've done, Victor said, his steel-gray eyes as emotionless as a shark's, and I felt my heart rate spike as the moment I'd both feared and anticipated finally arrived. He knew about the safe, knew that it had been accessed while he was in Los Angeles, and his security system had captured a brief thermal signature that proved someone had been in his study during the 2-minute camera gap, even though it hadn't recorded clear images. I've spent the past 2 days reviewing everyone who had access to this house during my absence. And do you know what I discovered? That my head of security, James Whitmore, a man I've employed for 15 years, has been betraying me, helping my son's widow investigate me like I'm some kind of criminal, Victor said, his voice getting quieter and more dangerous with each word. He pulled out his phone and showed me footage of James entering my suite multiple times, of us walking through hallways together, of our conversation outside the supplies closet after we'd fled the study. The surveillance was far more extensive than I'd realized, cameras I hadn't known existed, and I understood that Victor's paranoia had created a security network that captured everything. Victor walked to his desk and pressed a button I hadn't noticed before, and a section of wall panel slid away to reveal a monitor showing live security feeds. And my stomach dropped as I saw James being forcibly detained by Victor's security team in a basement room I'd never known existed. James is currently being questioned about the extent of his betrayal, and depending on what he tells my associates, he may or may not survive the evening. Corporate espionage and theft of proprietary information are serious matters that require serious consequences. Victor said with casual cruelty that made me want to vomit. I stared at the monitor watching James struggle against restraints, and I realized Victor had been planning this all along, had known about our investigation for days, and had been gathering evidence of our activities to use against us. The fundraiser wasn't just a public alibi, it was a stage where Victor would eliminate his problems while surrounded by witnesses who would testify to his innocence because they'd been drinking his champagne and eating his food while murder happened in the basement. Now, Naomi, you're going to tell me exactly what you found in my safe, who you've been working with besides James, and what you've done with any copies of my private documents. And if you're truthful and cooperative, I might let you disappear quietly rather than arranging an accident like the one that killed my son, Victor said, and hearing him casually admit to murdering Daniel made something inside me snap. I thought about the encrypted phone in my clutch with its recording function, about the FBI agents downstairs waiting for a signal, about Daniel's warning that I should run and my decision to fight instead, and I made a choice that was either brilliant or suicidal. I pulled out my phone, activated the recording with a subtle gesture, and looked Victor directly in his cold eyes. You mean the accident, where you had Daniel drugged and his brakes tampered with, because he was going to expose your criminal empire. That accident, Victor? The one you planned in your journal with Margaret's help, the murder you documented in your own handwriting. Victor's face transformed into something genuinely terrifying, rage replacing calculation, and he moved toward me with frightening speed for a man his age. But I was already backing toward the door while continuing to record. You think you're clever because you found some documents? You think anyone will believe a grieving widow who's obviously unstable? I've destroyed people with far more evidence and credibility than you possess. Naomi, you're nothing but a schoolteacher playing detective, and you're about to learn what happens when amateurs challenge professionals, Victor snarled, and he grabbed my wrist hard enough to leave bruises, trying to take the phone. We struggled, his strength surprising me, and I screamed as loudly as I could, knowing the FBI agents downstairs would hear and respond. The study door burst open and James Whitmore stood there, blood on his face and zip ties dangling from one wrist, having clearly escaped from Victor's security team. And behind him I saw 2 FBI agents in catering uniforms drawing weapons. Everything happened incredibly fast after that. FBI agents swarmed the study while others secured the fundraiser downstairs, reading Victor his rights while he screamed about lawyers and false accusations and connections to senators who would destroy their careers. Margaret Hines tried to run and was tackled on the front lawn by agents who'd been disguised as valet parking staff, and watching her ice-blue eyes finally show real fear was deeply satisfying. The guests were detained and interviewed, computers and files were seized, and Victor's estate became a crime scene with federal agents methodically documenting everything. I sat on the terrace with a blanket around my shoulders despite the warm evening, watching Victor being led away in handcuffs while news helicopters circled overhead broadcasting the arrest of one of America's wealthiest men. Elena arrived within the hour, having driven at dangerous speeds from her apartment, and she wrapped me in a hug that finally let me break down and cry for everything I'd survived and everything I'd lost. The recording I'd made of Victor admitting to Daniel's murder became the centerpiece of the federal case. Combined with all the evidence from his safe and computer files, and Elena's FBI contacts confirmed they had enough to prosecute Victor on 73 separate counts, including first-degree murder, conspiracy, money laundering, RICO violations, and crimes that would keep him in federal prison for the rest of his life. But as I sat there watching justice unfold, I realized this wasn't really an ending but a beginning. The start of rebuilding my life from the ashes of everything Victor had destroyed and becoming someone Daniel would have been proud of. But you need to hear what happened in the trial, how Victor tried to manipulate his way out of justice, and how I testified against him in a courtroom packed with media. So subscribe right now, because Chapter 8 covers the legal battle that captivated the nation. Comment below and tell me how you're feeling right now, because I know this chapter was intense. And I need to know you're ready for the final chapters where everything comes full circle. Share this story because we're about to show you that sometimes the good guys really do win. But first we have to survive the courtroom where Victor has one last chance to destroy me. The arrest is just the beginning. The real battle is about to start. How do you testify against the man who murdered your husband while he stares at you from across a courtroom with eyes that promise revenge? 6 months after Victor's arrest, I sat in the federal courthouse downtown Seattle, wearing a navy suit that Elena had helped me select, my hands folded on the witness stand while 300 spectators and 50 journalists watched my every movement. Victor sat at the defense table in an orange jumpsuit that looked obscene on someone who'd only ever worn tailored $1,000 suits, his salt and pepper hair now fully gray from stress, his steel-gray eyes boring into me with hatred so pure it was almost physical. His legal team was a wall of expensive attorneys led by Hamilton Crane, a legendary defense lawyer who'd gotten tech CEOs and Wall Street criminals acquitted on charges that should have been slam dunks, and I knew they were about to try destroying my credibility in front of the entire nation. The prosecution team led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Morrison had prepped me for 3 days, mock cross-examinations and hostile questioning designed to prepare me for what Crane would throw at me. But sitting there under Victor's malevolent stare, I felt every bit of courage threatening to evaporate. Jennifer Morrison stood to begin direct examination, her questions methodical and clear, walking me through my relationship with Daniel, the funeral where Victor had first approached me, and the systematic coercion he'd used to force me into his estate and his life. I answered each question carefully, keeping my voice steady despite wanting to scream. And when Jennifer asked me to describe finding Daniel's hidden files, I watched Victor's jaw clench with rage at hearing his crimes cataloged for the public record. The courtroom was absolutely silent except for my testimony, journalists frantically typing and sketch artists capturing the moment. And I felt the weight of everyone's attention as I explained how I'd discovered that my husband had been murdered by his own father. Hamilton Crane objected repeatedly, claiming my testimony was speculation and hearsay, but Jennifer countered with the journal entries and video files that proved every word I spoke, and the judge overruled each objection with visible satisfaction at watching a corrupt billionaire finally facing justice. When Hamilton Crane stood for cross-examination, he transformed into something predatory and calculating, his expensive suit and silver hair making him look like an older, more sophisticated version of Victor himself. He started gently, offering condolences for my loss, acknowledging the trauma of losing a husband, and I recognized the strategy immediately. Make me comfortable before going for the kill. Then his questions turned sharp, suggesting I'd been having financial difficulties before Daniel's death, implying I'd married into money and resented when Daniel chose a modest lifestyle, painting me as someone with motive to fabricate stories about Victor for financial gain through lawsuits and book deals. I felt my temper rising but remembered Jennifer's coaching. Stay calm, answer only what's asked, don't let them make you emotional. Crane produced my teaching salary records, my student loan debt, the credit card bills I'd been slowly paying down, trying to make the jury believe I was a gold digger who'd seen opportunity in tragedy. But Crane's strategy fell apart when Jennifer redirected, and I was able to explain that I'd refused Victor's offered allowance multiple times, that I'd continued teaching part-time even while living at his estate, and that I'd risked my life gathering evidence not for money, but because my husband had been murdered. The jury's faces shifted as I spoke, several nodding in understanding, and I saw Crane realize his character assassination hadn't worked. The prosecution then called James Whitmore, who testified about Victor ordering him to surveil Daniel in the weeks before his death, about being asked to recommend discreet contractors who could arrange accidents, and about his growing horror as he realized what Victor was planning. James's military bearing and obvious discomfort at testifying against a former employer made him a powerful witness, and when Crane tried to suggest James was lying to avoid his own prosecution for corporate espionage, Jennifer produced immunity agreements showing James had cooperated fully with federal investigators from the moment Victor was arrested. Elena Torres testified next, walking the jury through her 3-year investigation into Victor's empire, and she brought credibility and documentation that Crane couldn't shake despite his best efforts. She presented the shell company networks, the offshore accounts, the pattern of competitors and whistleblowers who'd met untimely ends or suffered mysterious financial ruin. And she explained how Daniel had contacted her with insider information that corroborated everything she'd independently discovered. Crane tried to paint her as a journalist with an anti-wealth agenda, someone who targeted successful businessmen out of ideological bias. But Elena calmly produced Pulitzer Prize nominations and recommendations from federal prosecutors who'd used her investigations to build previous cases. The jury ate it up, particularly when Elena described receiving Daniel's encrypted files 2 days before his death with a note that read, "If something happens to me, my father is responsible." The most devastating testimony came from Rachel Morrison, the woman who'd warned me at the fundraiser about Victor's control over her husband. She took the stand trembling, her perfect society wife facade cracked to reveal genuine terror, and she described how Victor had systematically destroyed her husband's business partner, who disagreed with illegal accounting practices. How Victor had orchestrated a hostile takeover using insider information he'd obtained through threatening their family, and how her husband now lived in constant fear of Victor's reach even from federal prison. Rachel's testimony opened the floodgates for 7 other witnesses, all business partners or family members of Victor's victims. People who'd been too afraid to speak up before but now found courage in numbers. They painted a picture of Victor Carter as a man who'd spent 30 years building an empire on fear and violence, who'd destroyed anyone who stood in his way, and who'd ultimately murdered his own son rather than face accountability for his crimes. The trial's centerpiece came when prosecutors played the video Daniel had recorded 3 weeks before his death, his kind face filling courtroom screens as he spoke directly to the camera. "My father, Victor Carter, has built his fortune on criminal activity including bribery, extortion, tax fraud, and money laundering, and I have documentation proving every allegation I'm making. I've given copies of this evidence to journalist Elena Torres and to federal investigators, and if something happens to me, I want everyone to know that my father is capable of murder and that I don't trust the local police he's paid off to investigate properly." The courtroom was absolutely silent as Daniel's voice echoed from the grave, accusing his own father of planning his death, and I watched tears streaming down jury members' faces while Victor sat stone-faced at the defense table. Crane objected that the video was prejudicial and hearsay, that dead men's accusations shouldn't be admissible, but the judge ruled that Daniel's state of mind was relevant and the video spoke to premeditation and motive. But Victor's defense team saved their most dramatic move for last, calling Victor himself to testify despite every lawyer knowing that putting defendants on the stand rarely works. Victor took the oath with the same commanding presence he'd used in boardrooms, and watching him perform grief and bewilderment for the jury was like watching a masterclass in manipulation. He claimed Daniel had been mentally unstable, that he'd tried to get his son help for paranoid delusions about being followed and watched, that the investigation into his business practices was really about Daniel's deteriorating mental state, causing him to misinterpret normal business transactions as criminal conspiracies. Crane asked leading questions that allowed Victor to paint himself as a concerned father watching his son spiral into madness, as someone who'd never imagined Daniel would go so far as to fabricate evidence and recruit others into his delusions. Several jury members looked uncertain, Victor's performance working exactly as his expensive lawyers had planned. But Jennifer Morrison's cross-examination destroyed Victor's carefully constructed defense in under 10 minutes. She started by playing the recording I'd made the night of his arrest, Victor's voice clear and cold as he admitted to arranging Daniel's accident, boasted about destroying people who challenged him, and threatened me with the same fate. Victor tried to claim the recording was edited or taken out of context, but Jennifer produced the complete, unedited version plus forensic analysis, proving it was authentic. Then she brought out Victor's journal, the leather-bound record of his crimes written in his own hand, and she read entry after entry detailing bribes and threats and illegal schemes, forcing Victor to either claim someone forged 30 years of journal entries or admit he'd documented his own criminal enterprise. Victor's commanding presence evaporated as Jennifer methodically destroyed every lie he'd told, his face turning red with rage as he realized his testimony had just sealed his conviction. The jury deliberated for 4 hours, and when they returned with guilty verdicts on all 73 counts, the courtroom erupted in gasps and a few scattered cheers that the judge gavelled down. Victor showed no emotion as the verdicts were read, his face frozen in the cold mask I'd seen so many times. But when the judge announced he would be sentenced to life in federal prison without possibility of parole, something flickered in his steel-gray eyes that looked almost like fear. I sat in the gallery with Elena holding my hand and James standing behind me in his security position one last time, and we watched Victor Carter being led away in chains, his empire demolished, his crimes exposed, his power finally broken by the truth. The judge also ordered the seizure of all Carter family assets under RICO statutes, meaning the billions Victor had stolen would be distributed to his victims and their families, a kind of poetic justice that Daniel would have appreciated. Outside the courthouse, I gave my first and only press conference, standing before a wall of microphones and cameras with Jennifer Morrison beside me. I thanked Elena and James for their courage, thanked the FBI agents who'd protected me, and dedicated the verdict to Daniel's memory and to all of Victor's victims who'd suffered in silence. Reporters shouted questions about my plans, whether I'd write a book or make a movie deal, how I felt about the verdict, but I just smiled and said that I was going back to teaching because that's what Daniel would have wanted, to continue living the honest, meaningful life we'd built together before his father destroyed it. The truth was I didn't know what came next, how I would rebuild from the trauma and loss. But standing there in the afternoon sun with justice finally served, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: hope. But this isn't quite the end of the story, because there's one more chapter where I reveal what happened after Victor's conviction, how his criminal network collapsed, and what I discovered about my own strength in the aftermath of everything. Subscribe now, because Chapter 9 shows you the aftermath and the new life I built from the ashes. And I promise you it's a chapter about healing and justice, and proving that survivors can become heroes. Comment below and tell me how you're feeling after watching Victor Carter finally get what he deserved. And share this story with anyone who needs to believe that sometimes the truth really does win. We're almost at the end, and I need you with me for the final chapter. What do you do with your life after you've destroyed a billionaire's empire and testified at the trial of the century? I stood in the empty Carter estate 6 months after Victor's conviction, watching moving trucks cart away the last of the seized artwork and furniture that would be auctioned to compensate his victims, and I felt nothing but relief at seeing this monument to corruption dismantled piece by piece. The federal government had offered me a significant financial settlement from Victor's seized assets, compensation for emotional distress and Daniel's wrongful death. But I'd taken only enough to pay off my student loans and Daniel's final medical bills, donating the rest to a foundation supporting families of corporate crime victims. Elena thought I was crazy for turning down millions. But keeping Victor's money felt like letting him win, like admitting that I'd gone through everything for financial gain rather than justice. The estate would be sold to a tech CEO who planned to turn it into a private retreat for nonprofit leaders. And I found poetic justice in Victor's showplace of corruption becoming a place for people doing genuine good in the world. James Whitmore had become an unlikely friend, meeting me weekly for coffee where we processed the trauma we'd both survived and talked about Daniel's memory with people who'd truly known him. James had lost his career in private security after testifying against Victor. No wealthy client wanting to hire someone who'd betrayed a previous employer regardless of the circumstances. But he'd found new purpose training FBI agents in security protocols and speaking at law enforcement conferences about recognizing and reporting corporate crime. He still carried guilt about not helping Daniel when my husband had first approached him, and I watched him work through that regret by dedicating his life to protecting whistleblowers and supporting investigations into corrupt power structures. We'd been through something together that bonded us permanently, survivors of Victor Carter's world who'd chosen truth over self-preservation and somehow lived to tell about it. Elena Torres had won a Pulitzer Prize for her coverage of Victor's trial and the investigation that preceded it, her 3-year commitment to exposing his crimes finally receiving the recognition it deserved. She'd written a book about the case that I'd helped fact-check, though I'd refused co-author credit despite her insistence. And the book had become a bestseller that was being adapted into a limited series by a major streaming network. Elena visited often, bringing wine and takeout and her infectious energy that had somehow survived years of staring into the darkness of human greed and corruption. She'd moved on to investigating other powerful criminals, her reputation as someone who couldn't be bought or intimidated making her simultaneously valuable and dangerous, and I worried about her safety even as I admired her courage. Our friendship had been forged in fire, and I knew that regardless of where our lives took us, we'd always have this connection built on shared purpose and mutual trust. I'd returned to teaching at Roosevelt High School, walking into my old classroom feeling both familiar and foreign after everything I'd survived. My students didn't know about my role in taking down Victor Carter. I'd kept my married name quiet during the trial, and most teenagers didn't follow white-collar crime news anyway. And I found peace in the normalcy of lesson plans and book discussions and teenagers complaining about homework. But I taught literature differently now, gravitated towards stories about justice and corruption and ordinary people standing up to power, and I watched my students engage with themes of moral courage in ways that suggested some of them understood more than they let on. One student, a quiet girl named Maya, stayed after class one day and said she'd recognized me from news coverage of the trial, that her family had been evicted by a Carter development project years ago, and that seeing me testify had given her hope that powerful people could be held accountable. I hugged her while she cried, and I realized that Daniel's death and my investigation had rippled out in ways I'd never fully understand, touching lives and inspiring courage in people I'd never meet. Margaret Hines had received a 15-year sentence for her role in Victor's crimes, pleading guilty to conspiracy and obstruction of justice in exchange for a reduced sentence and cooperation with prosecutors. Her testimony had helped convict 3 judges and 2 senators who'd been on Victor's payroll, her legal expertise making her uniquely positioned to explain the technical aspects of Victor's corruption network. I'd watched her sentencing via video feed, this woman who'd intimidated me so thoroughly during my introduction to Victor's world now looking small and defeated in her own orange jumpsuit, and I'd felt pity mixed with satisfaction at seeing her face consequences for enabling his evil. She'd sent me a letter from federal prison, an apology that felt hollow but might have been as genuine as someone like her could manage, and I'd thrown it away without responding because some betrayals couldn't be forgiven through words alone. The most unexpected development came when Victor's legitimate business partners, the ones who hadn't known about his criminal activities, reached out to offer me a position on the board of the restructured Carter Enterprises, which was being transformed into an ethical company focused on affordable housing development. They wanted someone who represented transparency and moral courage, someone whose presence would signal a complete break from Victor's corrupt legacy, and they offered me a salary that would have made my teacher's income look like pocket change. I considered it seriously, recognizing the opportunity to turn Victor's empire into something that actually helped people rather than exploiting them. But ultimately I declined because I needed to rebuild my own identity separate from anything Carter-related. Instead, I recommended Elena for the ethics oversight position they were creating, knowing she would be absolutely ruthless in ensuring the company stayed clean, and I smiled when she accepted the role while keeping her journalism career, refusing to choose between purpose and watchdog responsibility. I'd moved out of the house Daniel and I shared, the memories too painful to live with daily, and found a small apartment near the school with a view of nothing but other people's rooftops and a slice of sky. My new space was modest and mine, decorated with photographs of Daniel and books we'd collected together, and I found peace in simplicity that I'd never experienced in Victor's grand estate or even in the comfortable home Daniel had provided. I started dating again eventually, meeting a fellow teacher named Marcus who knew about my past and respected both my grief and my strength, who made me laugh and didn't try to replace Daniel or compete with his memory. It felt strange and right simultaneously, moving forward while honoring what I'd lost, and I realized that surviving trauma didn't mean forgetting or pretending the pain hadn't happened. It meant carrying that weight while still choosing to live fully and love again. On the anniversary of Daniel's death, I visited his grave with flowers and the leather journal he'd always carried for noting favorite quotes from books he loved. I sat on the grass beside his headstone and told him everything. About Victor's conviction, about the lives we'd saved by exposing his planned crimes, about the foundation in Daniel's name that supported whistleblowers and corporate ethics education. I told him about Marcus and how guilty I felt for finding happiness again. And I could almost hear Daniel's response that he'd want me to live and love and not spend my life as a monument to grief. The cemetery was quiet except for birds and distant traffic, and I felt a sense of peace settle over me that I hadn't experienced since before his death. Not closure exactly because grief doesn't close, but acceptance that I'd honored his memory in the most meaningful way possible by ensuring his death brought about the justice he'd fought for. I'd started writing my own book, not about the trial or Victor's crimes which Elena had already covered brilliantly, but about resilience and finding strength you didn't know you possessed when life demanded it. I wrote about ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances, about teachers and security guards and journalists who chose courage over comfort, about the small decisions that accumulated into taking down an empire. My agent thought it would sell well, piggybacking on the public fascination with Victor's case. But I wrote it because I needed to process what I'd survived and maybe help other people facing their own battles against seemingly insurmountable power. The book wouldn't make me rich or famous, but it would be true and hopefully useful, which felt like the right kind of legacy to build from the ashes of trauma. The final surprise came when the FBI contacted me about joining their white-collar crime task force as a civilian consultant, helping them understand how corporate criminals manipulate and control victims, teaching agents to recognize the patterns I'd experienced firsthand. They wanted to use my story to train investigators in recognizing when wealthy suspects were isolating and grooming witnesses, and they offered flexible hours that would allow me to continue teaching while contributing to ongoing investigations. I accepted immediately, Realizing this was how I could turn my trauma into ongoing purpose, ensuring that other victims might be identified and saved before their situations escalated to murder. It felt like coming full circle, from schoolteacher to victim to survivor to someone actively fighting the kind of corruption that had destroyed my husband. And I knew Daniel would have been proud of the person I'd become through surviving the worst thing that could happen and choosing to use that pain to help others. So that's where I am now, nearly 2 years after standing at Daniel's grave and meeting Victor's cold eyes for the first time. Teaching literature to teenagers, consulting with federal investigators, writing a book about resilience, dating someone who makes me happy, and slowly rebuilding a life that honors both my grief and my survival. Victor Carter is serving life in federal prison. His empire is dismantled, his victims are compensated, and his name is synonymous with corporate corruption rather than business genius. I still have nightmares sometimes. Wake up thinking I'm trapped in his estate, or that he's somehow escaped prison to finish what he started. But those nights are becoming rarer as time passes and healing continues. I've learned that justice doesn't erase trauma, but it helps, and that surviving something terrible can actually make you stronger if you refuse to let it define your entire existence. But there's one final chapter, one last piece of this story that brings everything full circle and shows you exactly what happened when I visited Victor in prison to tell him face to face that he lost and I won. Subscribe if you haven't already, because Chapter 10 is the emotional conclusion where I confront the man who murdered my husband and tried to destroy me. And I promise you it's a conversation you won't want to miss. Comment below and tell me what you would say to Victor if you had the chance. And share this story with anyone who needs to believe that surviving abuse and trauma can lead to strength and purpose. One more chapter, and then you'll have the complete story of how a schoolteacher took down a billionaire and rebuilt her life from the ashes. Would you visit the man who murdered your husband if given the chance to tell him exactly what his crimes cost? I sat in the visitor's room of FCI Victorville Federal Prison, waiting behind bulletproof glass with a phone receiver growing slippery in my sweating palm, and I questioned for the 100th time whether this was closure or just self-inflicted torture. 18 months had passed since Victor's conviction, 18 months of therapy and healing and rebuilding, and I'd finally reached a place where I could face him without falling apart. Elena thought I was crazy for requesting this visit. Marcus worried it would set back my progress, but James understood immediately why I needed to look Victor in the eyes one final time and show him that I'd survived everything he'd done to me. The room was institutional and depressing, gray walls and metal furniture, and the smell of industrial cleaner failing to mask decades of despair. And I reminded myself that Victor would spend the rest of his life in places like this, his power and luxury stripped away, leaving only the monster he'd always been beneath the expensive suits. When Victor entered the prisoner's side, I barely recognized him. The commanding billionaire had been replaced by a gaunt man in his 60s wearing an orange jumpsuit that hung on his diminished frame, his salt and pepper hair now completely gray and cut prison short, his steel gray eyes sunken, but still containing that predatory calculation I remembered. He'd aged 20 years in 18 months, prison apparently being less kind than the luxury he'd taken for granted his entire life, and I felt a flash of satisfaction at seeing him reduced to just another inmate without power or influence. He picked up the phone on his side with hands that shook slightly, and when he spoke his voice had lost its smooth authority, replaced by a hoarseness that suggested he'd been screaming or crying or both. "Naomi, I didn't expect you to come. I thought you'd be too afraid of me even in here." I let the silence stretch, making him wait, taking back some of the power he'd stolen from me in his study, that night he'd tried to make me disappear. "I'm not afraid of you anymore, Victor. You're just a sad old man in prison who destroyed everything he touched, including his own son. And I came here to tell you that Daniel won, that everything he fought for came true, and that you'll die in here knowing you lost to a schoolteacher and a security guard and a journalist who refused to be intimidated by your money and threats." I watched his jaw clench at hearing Daniel's name, watched the flash of rage in his eyes that proved he was still the same monster underneath the prison-diminished exterior. And I felt strangely calm knowing that I'd survived his worst and come out stronger. Victor leaned forward, pressing his face close to the glass, and his voice dropped to the menacing tone I remembered from that night in his study. "You think you've won? You think destroying my companies and taking my money means you've beaten me? I have connections in here, Naomi, people I've helped who owe me favors, and accidents happen in prison just like they happen outside." I actually laughed, the sound surprising me as much as it obviously surprised him. and I watched his expression shift to confusion as he realized I wasn't scared. You're threatening me from federal prison while serving life without parole? Victor, you're so pathetic that it's actually sad. You spent your entire life believing that money and power made you untouchable, that you could kill your own son and destroy anyone who challenged you. And now you're sitting in an orange jumpsuit, making threats you can't possibly carry out, while I'm on the other side of this glass living a good life that honors Daniel's memory. I pulled out my phone and showed him photos through the glass. Me teaching my students, me speaking at the FBI Academy, me and Marcus laughing at dinner, me at Elena's Pulitzer ceremony, me living a full and meaningful life while he rotted in prison. His face cycled through emotions, rage, grief, denial, and I realized he genuinely expected me to crumble, to still be the terrified widow he'd manipulated in his estate. Daniel always said you were the strongest person he knew, said you had a core of steel under all that kindness. I thought he was being sentimental about his little wife, Victor said, his voice cracking slightly, and for a moment I saw something that might have been genuine emotion cross his face. He asked about Daniel's grave, whether I still visited, whether I'd forgiven him for the arguments they'd had before Daniel left the family business, and I realized with shock that Victor actually wanted absolution, wanted me to tell him that his son hadn't died hating him. The audacity of that desire, that this murderer thought he deserved comfort about his victim's final feelings, made me angry in a way his threats hadn't. Daniel died knowing his father was a criminal who would probably have him killed to protect his empire, and he spent his last weeks gathering evidence to expose you. So no, Victor, he didn't forgive you, he died trying to destroy you, and I finished what he started. Victor broke down then, actually crying into the phone while I watched him passively, and corrections officers moved closer thinking there was a problem. He sobbed about losing his son, about the empire he'd built being dismantled, about spending the rest of his life in prison, and I felt nothing but cold satisfaction at witnessing his complete destruction. This was the man who'd murdered Daniel without remorse, who'd threatened me in his study, who'd built an empire by destroying lives, and now he wanted sympathy for experiencing the consequences of his own evil. I let him cry, let him exhaust himself with grief that should have been felt before he murdered his son rather than after being caught, and when he finally looked up with red-rimmed eyes, I delivered the words I'd come to say. You taught me something valuable, Victor. You taught me that real power doesn't come from money or fear. It comes from truth and courage, and refusing to be broken by evil men. So thank you for that lesson. I'll carry it for the rest of my life. I told Victor about the foundation established in Daniel's name, about the students I'd helped through the ethics scholarship program, about the corporate whistleblowers who'd found courage from reading about our case, and about the families who'd received compensation from his seized assets and were rebuilding their lives after his development projects had destroyed them. Your entire legacy is being erased, Victor. Every building with your name is being renamed, every award you received is being rescinded, and every life you destroyed is being made whole with your stolen money. So you'll die in here knowing that you've been completely erased from the world you tried to dominate. His face hardened at that, the grieving father facade dropping away to reveal the cold predator one final time, and he stood up preparing to end the visit on his own terms, to take back some tiny measure of control. But before he could hang up, I stopped him with one final statement. There's something you should know about your death, Victor. When it happens, whether from old age or prison violence or whatever end finds you, I won't be there. No one from your family will claim your body, and you'll be buried in a pauper's grave in the prison cemetery with just a number instead of your name. Because that's what happens to people who destroy their own families for money and power. They die alone and unmourned and forgotten. I watched those words hit him harder than any physical blow could have. Watched him realize that his worst nightmare wasn't prison or poverty, but insignificance, and he stood there frozen with the phone to his ear, unable to respond. I hung up first, took that power from him, and walked out of the visitor's room without looking back, knowing I would never see Victor Carter again, and feeling absolutely fine about that. Outside the prison, Elena was waiting in her car, having insisted on driving me despite my protests that I could handle it alone, and we sat in the parking lot while I processed what I'd just done. How do you feel? Elena asked, her dark eyes searching my face for signs of trauma or regression, and I thought about the question carefully before answering. I felt lighter, cleansed somehow of the last remaining power Victor had held over me through my fear and anger, and I realized that by facing him I'd proven to myself that I truly had survived and healed. I feel free. I finally said, and Elena smiled that wild grin I'd come to associate with her victories over corruption and evil. We drove away from that prison with its razor wire and guard towers, leaving Victor to his fate, and I felt the last chains of trauma falling away as the building disappeared in the rearview mirror. 6 months later, I received notification that Victor Carter had died in federal prison. The official cause listed as complications from a heart condition exacerbated by stress, though prison rumors suggested he'd been killed by another inmate whose family had been destroyed by one of Victor's development projects years earlier. I felt nothing when I read the news, no grief or satisfaction or vindication, just a sense of a chapter closing on a dark period of my life. True to my prediction, no one claimed Victor's body, and he was buried in the prison cemetery under just a number. Inmate 04857-084. The irony of Victor Carter, the billionaire who'd spent his life accumulating wealth and power and status, ending up in an unmarked grave with just a number wasn't lost on anyone who'd followed the case. And the news coverage of his death focused more on his crimes than his accomplishments, exactly the legacy he'd feared most. I'm sitting in my apartment now, 3 years after Daniel's death and 2 years after Victor's conviction, writing the final pages of my book and reflecting on everything that's happened. Marcus is cooking dinner in the kitchen, something with garlic that smells amazing, and later we'll grade papers together while watching some mindless TV show that lets our brains relax. Tomorrow I'll teach my students about To Kill a Mockingbird and moral courage. I'll meet with FBI agents to discuss a new case of corporate intimidation, and I'll visit Daniel's grave with fresh flowers and updates about the foundation that bears his name. My life is full and meaningful and mine, built from the ashes of trauma into something Daniel would have been proud of. I've learned that surviving something terrible doesn't make you a victim forever, that fighting back against power isn't just for heroes in movies, and that sometimes ordinary people like teachers and security guards and journalists can actually change the world if they refuse to be silenced by fear. So that's my story, the complete truth of how I went from grieving widow to taking down a billionaire empire to rebuilding a life that honors both my loss and my survival. If you've been with me through all 10 chapters, thank you for listening, for believing me, for supporting this journey from funeral to freedom. I want you to know that if you're facing your own battle against powerful people who think they can destroy you, if you're trapped in a situation that feels hopeless, if you've lost someone to corruption or violence or evil, you're stronger than you know, and you can survive this. It won't be easy, the cost will be high, and there will be moments when you want to give up. But I promise you that on the other side of that fight is a life worth living and a sense of purpose that trauma alone could never create. Comment below one final time and tell me what this story meant to you, what you're taking away from Daniel's sacrifice and my fight and the justice we finally achieved. Share this with anyone who needs to hear that good can triumph over evil, that billionaires can be held accountable, and that sometimes the most ordinary people become extraordinary when circumstances demand it. And if you're still not subscribed after 10 chapters of this journey, hit that button now and join a community of people who believe that truth and courage matter more than money and power. Thank you for being here. Thank you for witnessing my story, and remember, you're stronger than anyone who tries to break you, and your voice matters more than you know. 6 months later, I received notification that Victor Carter had died in federal prison. The official cause listed as complications from a heart condition exacerbated by stress, though prison rumors suggested he'd been killed by another inmate whose family had been destroyed by one of Victor's development projects years earlier. I felt nothing when I read the news, no grief or satisfaction or vindication, just a sense of a chapter closing on a dark period of my life. True to my prediction, no one claimed Victor's body, and he was buried in the prison cemetery under just a number. Inmate 04857-084. The irony of Victor Carter, the billionaire who'd spent his life accumulating wealth and power and status, ending up in an unmarked grave with just a number wasn't lost on anyone who'd followed the case. And the news coverage of his death focused more on his crimes than his accomplishments, exactly the legacy he'd feared most. I'm sitting in my apartment now, 3 years after Daniel's death and 2 years after Victor's conviction, writing the final pages of my book and reflecting on everything that's happened. Marcus is cooking dinner in the kitchen, something with garlic that smells amazing, and later we'll grade papers together while watching some mindless TV show that lets our brains relax. Tomorrow I'll teach my students about To Kill a Mockingbird and moral courage. I'll meet with FBI agents to discuss a new case of corporate intimidation, and I'll visit Daniel's grave with fresh flowers and updates about the foundation that bears his name. My life is full and meaningful and mine, built from the ashes of trauma into something Daniel would have been proud of. I've learned that surviving something terrible doesn't make you a victim forever, that fighting back against power isn't just for heroes in movies, and that sometimes ordinary people like teachers and security guards and journalists can actually change the world if they refuse to be silenced by fear. So that's my story, the complete truth of how I went from grieving widow to taking down a billionaire empire to rebuilding a life that honors both my loss and my survival. If you've been with me through all 10 chapters, thank you for listening, for believing me, for supporting this journey from funeral to freedom. I want you to know that if you're facing your own battle against powerful people who think they can destroy you, if you're trapped in a situation that feels hopeless, if you've lost someone to corruption or violence or evil, you're stronger than you know, and you can survive this. It won't be easy, the cost will be high, and there will be moments when you want to give up. But I promise you that on the other side of that fight is a life worth living and a sense of purpose that trauma alone could never create. Comment below one final time and tell me what this story meant to you, what you're taking away from Daniel's sacrifice and my fight and the justice we finally achieved. Share this with anyone who needs to hear that good can triumph over evil, that billionaires can be held accountable, and that sometimes the most ordinary people become extraordinary when circumstances demand it. And if you're still not subscribed after 10 chapters of this journey, hit that button now and join a community of people who believe that truth and courage matter more than money and power. Thank you for being here. Thank you for witnessing my story, and remember, you're stronger than anyone who tries to break you, and your voice matters more than you know.